In 1933, a Kansas farmer named Roy Stryker watched his wife scrape mud off potato peelings, boil them in salted water, and serve them to their 3 children as supper. That was their dinner, twice that same week. Today, what you are about to see would make most Americans push their plate away in disgust. Number 14 on this list was so revolting that public health officials at the time warned families against eating it. They ate it anyway. Number 3 contains an ingredient that modern food safety laws would consider a crime to serve. And number 1, the meal that fed more American children during the Depression than any government program ever did may be the saddest dish ever cooked on American soil. Hit that subscribe button. Let us count down the 25 worst Depression-era meals Americans were forced to eat to survive. Number 25, the onion sandwich. 2 slices of day-old white bread, a thick slab of raw white onion in between, and if a family was lucky, a thin smear of yellow mustard or mayonnaise to cut the sharpness. That was lunch. That was sometimes dinner. In tenement apartments across New York, Pittsburgh, and Chicago, mothers packed these into lunch pails for husbands going down to factory gates that might not have work for them. The onion burned the back of the throat. It made the eyes water at the kitchen table. Children learned to take small bites and chew with their mouths open to let the sharpness escape. A 5-pound sack of onions cost about 19 cents in 1932 and could last a family 2 weeks. White bread was 8 cents a loaf. No protein, no vegetables besides the onion itself, no comfort. Just the hot, raw bite of allium against bread, eaten quickly so the taste did not linger. People who lived through it remembered the smell on their breath for hours afterward. Number 24, dandelion greens. When the meat ran out and the canned vegetables ran out and there was nothing left in the root cellar, mothers sent children out into the yard with a paring knife. Dandelion greens, foraged free from lawns, roadsides, and railroad embankments, became dinner. The young leaves were the only ones that worked. The older ones turned so bitter they could not be swallowed without gagging. Children boiled them in salted water for 20 minutes to soften the harshness, then dressed them with a splash of vinegar and a teaspoon of bacon grease if any was left in the can on the stove. The taste was metallic, earthy, and stubbornly bitter no matter how long they cooked. Modern foragers treat dandelion greens as a superfood. Depression families ate them because the alternative was an empty plate. There was no romance in it. There was only the sour green pile on the supper plate and the knowledge that this was what dinner had become. Number 23, ketchup soup. This was the meal that broke even the proudest mothers. A diner in your town might let you take handfuls of free ketchup packets from the counter. You would walk home with your pockets full. At the stove, you would squeeze the entire stash into a saucepan of hot water, stir in a pinch of salt and pepper, and serve it in a bowl with a piece of saltine cracker crumbled on top. That was supper. Hot water flavored with sugar and tomato paste, pretending to be soup. The taste was thin, sweet, and faintly chemical. Children sapped the crackers in it because the crackers gave the illusion of something solid. A box of saltines from the corner store cost 10 cents and made the whole bowl feel almost like a meal. Restaurant workers across America watched this happen and said nothing. Some of them slipped extra packets into the bags of regulars they recognized as struggling. It was the quietest form of charity in 1930s America. Number 22, Hoover stew. Named bitterly after the president most blamed for the crash, Hoover stew was what happened when a family pooled the absolute cheapest ingredients available into one pot and called it dinner. Sliced hot dogs, a can of pork and beans, a can of stewed tomatoes, and elbow macaroni were all dumped together and simmered for 20 minutes. The hot dogs were the cheapest ones, sold in packs of 10 for about 15 cents at corner stores. The whole pot cost roughly 35 cents and fed 6 people. The taste was strange and confused. The sweetness of the beans fought with the sourness of the tomatoes and the rubbery, salty bite of the hot dog slices. The macaroni absorbed all of it into a starchy, pinkish mass that sat heavy in the stomach. Children ate it because they had to. Adults ate it because the alternative was watching the children eat alone. The dish appeared in Hooverville camps, in tent cities along railroad tracks, and on the kitchen tables of millions of families who had been middle class only 3 years earlier. Number 21, mock apple pie. Here is one of the strangest deceptions in American culinary history. When apples cost more than a family could spare, mothers made apple pie without any apples at all. The filling was made from crushed Ritz crackers, water, sugar, cream of tartar, lemon juice, and cinnamon. Boiled down on the stove, the cracker crumbs absorbed the syrup and turned into something with the texture of cooked apple slices. The cream of tartar gave it a faint tartness. The cinnamon completed the illusion. Baked in a flaky lard crust, the finished pie genuinely fooled people at first bite. The taste was sweet and warm and almost convincing, but there was always a wrongness to it. A slight cardboard quality to the filling, a chemical edge from the cream of tartar, a hollowness where the actual fruit should have been. A sleeve of Ritz crackers cost 19 cents in 1934. 3 apples would have cost 30 cents. The math made the choice for thousands of families. Nabisco printed the recipe on the cracker box for decades afterward, and the dish became a kind of national in-joke about how desperate things had gotten. Number 20, water pie. If mock apple pie was deception, water pie was surrender. The filling was flour, sugar, vanilla extract, a pat of butter, and water. Just water. Poured into an unbaked pie crust and baked at 400 degrees until the surface set into a pale, custardy crust over a thin, sweet syrup beneath. The texture was almost like a runny caramel pudding inside the crust. The taste was sweet, vague, and slightly hot from the vanilla extract. There was nothing to it. No fruit, no eggs, no dairy, beyond a single tablespoon of butter. A whole pie cost about 8 cents to make. It fed 6 children 1 meager slice each. Mothers in West Virginia, Kentucky, and the Tennessee mountains made this when there was nothing else sweet in the house and a birthday was coming. It was the cheapest possible way to put something celebratory on the table. The children who ate it remembered it for the rest of their lives, and not always fondly. It tasted like wanting to do better and not being able to. Number 19, vinegar pie. Another pie made of almost nothing. White vinegar, sugar, flour, water, and butter were cooked into a thin, sour-sweet custard, then poured into a pie crust and baked. The vinegar gave it a tangy bite that vaguely resembled lemon, which is why this pie also went by the name poor man's lemon pie. But anyone who had ever eaten actual lemon pie knew the difference instantly. The vinegar's sharpness was harsher, more acidic, less complex. It scraped the back of the throat in a way real lemon never did. The sugar was supposed to round it out, but it never quite succeeded. A bottle of apple cider vinegar cost 12 cents and could make a dozen pies. Real lemons in winter were a luxury item, sometimes 8 cents apiece. The math, again, made the choice. Vinegar pie appeared on church potluck tables across the rural Midwest and was politely consumed by neighbors who knew exactly what it meant when the woman of the house brought it instead of a real dessert. Number 18, prune pudding. Even the White House could not escape Depression cooking. Eleanor Roosevelt, working with home economists, publicly served prune pudding to President Roosevelt and his guests as a symbol of austerity. The recipe was prunes, cornstarch, sugar, water, and a pinch of cinnamon, cooked until thick and served warm in small bowls. The taste was overwhelmingly of stewed prunes, sweet, dark, and slightly medicinal. The texture was glutinous and slightly slimy from the cornstarch. Newspapers reported on these White House menus, and home cooks across the country took the cue. If prune pudding was good enough for the president, it was good enough for them. Prunes cost about 15 cents a pound at A&P, and a single bag could make a week of desserts. Children hated it. They hated the laxative effects almost as much as they hated the flavor, but it was what their mothers served, and they ate it. Number 17, boiled wheat berries. Long before whole grains became fashionable health food, boiled wheat was breakfast for families too poor to buy oatmeal or cornflakes. Whole wheat kernels, the raw, unprocessed grain straight from the feed sack, were soaked overnight and boiled the next morning for 90 minutes until they softened into a chewy, nutty porridge. Served with a splash of canned milk and a sprinkle of brown sugar if there was any, this was what got farmers and their children moving before sunrise. The texture was alarming to anyone not raised on it. The kernels stayed slightly tough, popping between the teeth like the world's smallest beans. The flavor was earthy and raw and faintly grassy. A 25-pound sack of wheat intended for chicken feed cost about 60 cents and could feed a family of 6 breakfasts every morning for a month. Some children developed real affection for it. Others gagged it down their whole childhoods, then refused to eat anything resembling whole grain for the rest of their lives. Number 16, cornmeal mush 3 times a day. In Appalachian hollows and Mississippi Delta sharecropper cabins, cornmeal mush was not an occasional breakfast. It was breakfast, lunch, and supper. Boiling water, salt, and cornmeal were stirred together over a wood stove until the mixture thickened into a pale yellow porridge. For breakfast, it was served hot with a drizzle of molasses, if any was left. For lunch, leftover mush was sliced cold and eaten with the fingers like polenta cake. For supper, the cold slices were fried in lard until the edges turned crispy and golden. Then the cycle started again the next morning. A 10-pound sack of cornmeal cost 25 cents in 1933 and could feed a family for a week or more. The taste of cornmeal 3 times a day became something monotonous, almost unbearable. Children stopped tasting it altogether. They simply chewed and swallowed because the body needed fuel. Adults sometimes broke down at the supper table at the sight of yet another bowl of mush. It became the food that defined the absolute floor of American eating. Number 15, Milcorno. First pattern break. Here is where things get genuinely dystopian. In 1933, Cornell University's College of Home Economics, working with the New York State Emergency Relief Administration, developed an official Depression survival food called Milcorno. The formula was cornmeal, dried milk powder, and salt mixed in specific government-approved proportions. It cost roughly 5 cents per serving and was distributed as a relief food to needy families across New York State. The Cornell scientists genuinely believed they had created the perfect, cheap, nutritious food. The dish was prepared by stirring the dry mix into boiling water and cooking it into a thick mush, somewhere between porridge and paste. The taste was bland and chalky from the dried milk, with the rough texture of undercooked cornmeal. Children gagged on it. Mothers tried to disguise it with sugar, with cinnamon, with anything else in the cupboard. Cornell distributed Milcorno recipes for over a decade and presented it at the 1933 Chicago World's Fair as a triumph of nutritional science. The fact that a major American university spent years promoting this dish tells you everything about how desperate the country had become. Number 14, the lard sandwich. Bread, butter, and a thick smear of cold rendered pork fat between two slices of white bread, sometimes with a sprinkle of salt and pepper for flavor. That was a meal. Some families used bacon grease saved in a can on the stove. Some used straight white lard scooped from a tub bought at the butcher for 8 cents a pound. The fat melted slightly against the warmth of the hands as it was eaten, leaving a slick film on the lips and the fingers. The taste was rich and meaty and savory, but in a way that left a heavy coating on the inside of the mouth that no amount of water could wash away. Children ate these for lunch at school, hiding them inside lunch pails so other children would not see what they had. Adults ate them at work, pulling them from greasy paper sacks during shift breaks. Doctors at the time openly recommended lard sandwiches as a calorie-dense food for poor families. The cardiologists who came later would have wept. Number 13, mock turkey. When Thanksgiving came and there was no money for a turkey, mothers made do with the meat case scraps. Ground veal, ground pork, breadcrumbs, milk, eggs, sage, salt, and pepper were mixed together and shaped by hand into a vague turkey leg form, then baked in a pan with broth poured over the top to keep it moist. The mixture set up into a meatloaf shape that bore only the most distant resemblance to a turkey leg. The taste was somewhere between meatloaf and a poorly seasoned sausage. The sage attempted to fool the nose into smelling actual roasted poultry and partially succeeded. Children who had never tasted a real Thanksgiving turkey sometimes accepted this as the genuine article. Children who had tasted the real thing in better years sat at the table and tried not to cry. A pound of ground veal trimmings cost about 12 cents. A whole turkey would have cost $2. The math was brutal. Mock turkey appeared on tens of thousands of tables across America on Thanksgiving in 1932, 1933, and 1934. Number 12, the poor man's meal. 1 potato, 1 hot dog, 1 onion, and a tablespoon of bacon grease in a skillet. That was the entire recipe. The potato was diced small and fried first until the edges crisped. The onion went in next and softened into the potato. The hot dog, sliced into thin coins, joined them in the final 5 minutes and browned slightly at the edges. Salt and pepper were the only seasonings. The whole dish came together in 15 minutes and cost about 11 cents to make. It fed 2 people, maybe 3 if you stretched it. The taste was salty and starchy and fundamentally one note. The hot dog gave the only protein. The potato gave the only bulk. The onion gave the only flavor. It was the meal that working men ate before walking to factory gates that might not have work for them. It was Walt Disney's actual go-to dinner when he was broke in Kansas City before he made it big in California. It was hunger food that pretended to be a meal. Number 11, Spam fritters. When Hormel introduced Spam in 1937, it was specifically engineered for poor families and was eventually exported as part of the wartime food supply. But Depression families adopted it immediately. The cheapest preparation was Spam fritters. Slices of canned pork shoulder were dredged in flour, dipped in a thin batter of egg and milk, and fried in lard until the batter turned golden and crisp. The taste was salty and dense and unmistakably industrial. The fritter coating gave the illusion of something fancy, like a tempura, but the meat inside was still the pink, gelatinous, pre-cooked block of canned mystery pork that defined the era. A 12-ounce tin of Spam cost about 25 cents in 1937 and could be stretched into 2 or 3 meals by frying it this way. Children who grew up on Spam fritters either developed a lifelong affection for the stuff or a lifelong aversion. There was very little middle ground. The smell of Spam frying in a hot skillet became, for an entire generation, the smell of getting by. Number 10. Salmon loaf. A can of pink salmon, the cheapest fish protein at 22 cents a tall can, mixed with stale breadcrumbs, 1 egg, a chopped onion, and a squeeze of lemon juice if there was a lemon. The mixture was packed into a loaf pan and baked at 350 degrees for 45 minutes until it set firm enough to slice. The result was a dense, pale pink brick with the texture of damp sand and the flavor of canned fish concentrated to its maximum intensity. The cheap canned salmon contained skin and small bones, which were either mashed into the loaf or picked out by hand at the table. The breadcrumbs absorbed all the liquid and gave the loaf the unsettling quality of feeling somehow both wet and dry at the same time. Mothers served it with creamed peas from another can and called it Friday supper. The smell lingered in the kitchen for hours afterward. Children of strict Catholic families ate this almost every Friday for years and still flinch at the sight of canned salmon today. Number 9. Creamed chipped beef on toast. The military called it by an unprintable nickname involving manure. Civilians called it SOS, or chipped beef on toast, and ate it without complaint. Paper-thin slices of dried, salt-cured beef, sold in small glass jars for 25 cents, were torn into shreds and stirred into a thick white sauce of flour, butter, and milk, then ladled hot over white toast. The salt content of the chipped beef was so high that no additional seasoning was needed. The white sauce went almost gray from the beef. The toast soaked up the gravy and turned soft and limp beneath the weight of it. The taste was overwhelmingly salty, with an off-putting mineral edge from the cure. Some families served it for breakfast, some for lunch, some, when the budget collapsed entirely, for dinner. It filled the stomach, it provided protein, and it cost about 30 cents to feed 4 people. It also tasted, to most who remember it now, like something only desperation could have made acceptable. Number 8. Hoover hog. Second pattern break. The dark joke of Depression cooking was that the president got blamed for everything, including the wild animals people were forced to hunt to survive. Rabbit was called Hoover hog. Possum, raccoon, and even the occasional stray armadillo got the same treatment. In Texas, the armadillo became so common as poor man's protein that it was nicknamed the Hoover pig outright. The meat was tough, gamey, and stringy. Rabbit needed long braising to become tender. Possum was greasy and required parboiling to remove the strong taste. Raccoon needed every bit of fat stripped off before cooking, or the flavor became inedible. Mothers cooked these animals in tomato broth, in onion gravy, in any liquid that could mask the wildness. The smell while cooking was unmistakable. Neighbors knew what you were eating from a block away. There was no shame in it because everyone was doing it. But the children who grew up on Hoover hog never forgot the strange, greasy taste of possum or the small bones of rabbit that had to be picked out at the table. The dish was free if you could shoot it, and freeness was the only thing that mattered. Number 7. Squirrel stew. When the rabbits ran out, the squirrels came next. Boys as young as 8 were given a .22 caliber rifle and sent out into the woods on Saturday mornings, with the understanding that supper depended on their aim. A squirrel was cleaned by skinning, gutting, and removing the head, leaving a thin, pinkish carcass about the size of a softball. Each squirrel produced maybe 4 ounces of usable meat. A stew required at least 3 squirrels to feed a family, and many Saturdays produced fewer. The meat was simmered for 2 hours with potatoes, onions, and whatever herbs could be foraged from the kitchen garden, until the small carcasses fell apart and the broth turned dark and rich. The flavor was strong, nutty, and unmistakably wild. Tiny ribs and leg bones floated through the stew and had to be navigated with caution at the table. Children of Appalachia and the Ozarks grew up considering squirrel a normal Saturday night protein. They moved away from those hills as adults and never ate squirrel again, but the recipe stayed in their heads forever. Number 6, boiled cabbage and potatoes. The cheapest hot meal a family could put on the table that still looked like an actual dinner. 1 head of cabbage, 3 potatoes, an onion, and a piece of salt pork, or a few strips of bacon if there was any. Everything went into a pot of water and simmered until the cabbage collapsed into pale, soft ribbons and the potatoes broke at the touch of a spoon. The whole pot took an hour and required almost no attention. The smell, however, was the problem. Boiled cabbage gave off a sulfurous funk that worked its way into every fiber of the house and lingered for days. Neighbors could tell what you were having for dinner from the hallway. Children at school sometimes got teased about smelling like cabbage. The taste was mild and earthy and faintly sweet from the long-cooked cabbage. The texture was uniformly soft, almost like baby food. A whole head of cabbage cost 7 cents, and the meal fed 6 people for under 20 cents total. It kept families fed. It also made millions of American homes smell like a Slavic kitchen for the entire decade. Number 5, mock chicken legs. Here is one of the strangest creations of Depression cooking. When chicken was too expensive, mothers made fake chicken legs out of ground veal and pork, molded around a wooden skewer to mimic the shape of an actual drumstick. The meat mixture was seasoned with poultry herbs, sage and thyme, and a pinch of celery salt, breaded with cracker crumbs, and fried in lard until the outside turned golden brown. Served on a platter with the skewers sticking out as imitation bones, they looked from a distance almost like real fried chicken legs. Up close, the illusion fell apart. The texture was wrong. The smell was wrong. The taste was a confused fusion of pork sausage and herbs that vaguely suggested poultry without actually being poultry. Children grabbed for the bones to gnaw on the way they would with real chicken, only to find a wooden skewer with no marrow and no satisfaction. A pound of ground veal trimmings ran 14 cents. A real chicken was 75 cents. The substitution made economic sense. It made absolutely no sense to anyone who had ever tasted real fried chicken. Number 4, calf's foot jelly. Third pattern break. Here is where the food companies and the cookbooks of the era worked overtime to make poverty seem dignified. Calf's foot jelly was sold in the 1930s as a delicate invalid food, recommended by doctors for sick children, new mothers, and the elderly. It was, in reality, the boiled-down extract of cow hooves. The feet, bought from the butcher for a few cents apiece, were scraped clean, simmered in water for 6 hours, then strained. The liquid was cooled and set into a clear, slightly amber gelatin. Sometimes lemon and sugar were added, sometimes wine. The result was a wobbling, translucent dish served in glass cups with a spoon. The texture was disturbingly bouncy, like industrial gelatin. The taste was faintly meaty under the sweetness, a hint of beef broth that made the whole thing feel fundamentally confused. Was it dessert? Was it medicine? Was it dinner? Nobody quite knew. Doctors prescribed it. Mothers served it. Children ate it because they were told it would make them strong. It probably did, in a way. The collagen content was real, But the modern person watching their grandmother make this would understand instantly why so many Depression-era recipes have been quietly retired from the family cookbook. Number 3. Brain sandwiches. Most American cities had at least one diner that served brain sandwiches as a working-class lunch special. But in St. Louis and Indianapolis, the dish was elevated to genuine local tradition. Calf or pork brains were soaked in salt water for an hour to firm them up, then sliced, breaded in flour and egg, and fried until golden. The fried brain was served on white bread with raw onion and yellow mustard. The texture was the problem. Soft, creamy, almost custardy on the inside with a brittle fried shell on the outside. The contrast disturbed first-time eaters. The flavor was mild, faintly metallic, vaguely like scrambled eggs, but with an unmistakable organ meat undertone. A brain sandwich cost a nickel at a working-class diner in 1933 and provided enormous calories and nutrients for the money. They were sold in such volume that local butchers struggled to keep up with demand. Modern food safety laws, written in response to BSE and other concerns, would make this sandwich largely illegal to sell commercially today. In the 1930s, it was simply lunch. Number 2. Boiled potato peelings. This is where the absolute floor of Depression eating comes into view. When potatoes were too expensive to buy whole, families bought sacks of culls from farm produce stands, the bruised and damaged ones the grocers could not sell. Mothers peeled them carefully and used the white inner flesh for whatever meal was planned. The peelings, instead of being thrown away, were washed, salted, and boiled in water until they softened into a thin, grayish broth with limp curls of skin floating through it. Sometimes a piece of onion was added, sometimes a spoonful of bacon grease. The result was served hot in a bowl as soup. The taste was watery and starchy and almost entirely without character, with a faint earthy note from the skins themselves. Children sapped pieces of bread into the broth to give the meal some substance. A 10-pound sack of cull potatoes cost 15 cents, and using the peelings meant getting 2 meals from the same purchase. This was the meal that mothers cooked when there was nothing else. The shame of it never left the women who remembered serving it to their children. Number 1. Bread soup. Boiling water was poured over torn pieces of stale bread in a bowl, with a teaspoon of sugar stirred in and a splash of canned milk floated on top if there was any milk left in the can. That was the meal. That was dinner. That was breakfast and lunch and supper for hundreds of thousands of American children during the worst years of the Depression. In Hooverville camps along the railroad tracks of every major city, in tar paper shacks on the edges of Dust Bowl farms, in cold water tenement walk-ups in Brooklyn and Boston, bread soup was the bottom of the bottom. A loaf of bread cost 8 cents. A can of evaporated milk was 6 cents. A pound of sugar was 5 cents. The whole meal cost pennies and contained almost no nutrition beyond starch and a few calories of fat. The bread softened into a pale gray sludge in the bottom of the bowl. The sugar was supposed to make it palatable for the children. The milk was supposed to make it look like something more than what it was. Mothers spooned it into the mouths of their youngest because the youngest could not feed themselves yet, and the mothers wanted to make sure every last drop went where it was needed. There are oral histories of grown men in their 80s and 90s, recorded in the 1990s by the Smithsonian and other institutions, weeping when asked about bread soup. They remembered watching their mothers stand at the stove with their backs turned so the children could not see them cry. They remembered the wet, sugary slurry in the bowl and the way they pretended it was good. They remembered being told it was a treat. The lie was the kindness. The lie was what made it bearable. No meal on this list, none of the brains or the boiled hooves or the squirrels or the large sandwiches carried the weight of what bread soup actually meant. It was the meal that admitted there was nothing left. And millions of American families lived through entire winters eating it 3 times a day. We forgot it on purpose. We had to. Here is my challenge. Pick one of these. Just one. Maybe the mock apple pie, maybe the Hoover stew. Make it this week. Sit down at the table and eat it slow. Not because it is good, not because it is impressive, but because somebody before you ate it to survive, and the least we can do is remember how. Drop the one you are going to try in the comments. I want to know if water pie gets more attention than calf's foot jelly, because these meals were not just dinners. They were proof of what people will do to keep their children alive.